Welcome to Being Untamed, a channel focused on solutions-oriented activism through the lenses of cognitive science and systems theory. This series on effective understanding continues our discussion on why we don't act on what we know to be truly important as a larger thesis following alongside the Noble Eightfold Path, but it also stands on its own as I will explain the process of emergent mind mapping and contemplation practices. You should note the relatedness and usefulness of the Noble Eightfold Path, but I'm using different terminology of effective understanding instead of right view, as my goal here isn't to describe the Eightfold Path, but to see its analogies to a practical, solutions-oriented approach. Previously on Being Untamed. As we've laid the foundation of the path and foreseeing some traps along the way, what traps may we fall into when finding right view? How can our perception, sense-making, and meaning-making fall short, causing poor decision-making? In systems theory of village design, I pointed to insights gained from a systems thinking perspective and nonlinear thinking. So let's unpack that a little bit more today. Let's refine our ability to understand and have effective sense-making, thereby grounding ourselves towards right view. We have gone through an information age, holding on to so many more ideas, philosophies, stories, and concepts than ever before, and are mostly using the same tools for contemplating and communicating. All these previous tools were linear. There was a beginning and an end to the process. But we're seeing that there's no beginning and end to things, and instead finding the deep interdependence of all things is important to come to a grounded conclusion. All these stories and narratives we are consuming are just fragmented thoughts, and naively we are simply taxing our subconscious, hoping that it can make sense of all of it and guide our actions. But if we want to continue consuming more information, we must also spend more time integrating them to find convergence and coherence. We are seeing a lot of polarization, a lot of reductionistic, shallow understanding across the board. I would like to foster a more adaptable, process-oriented education system, and also a more rigorous spiritual and philosophical practices so that whatever this new culture ends up being, it doesn't simply turn into another ideology. In following series, I will be writing about paradigms, which is central to developing a nuanced, multi-perspectival understanding that can avoid ideological thinking and other forms of toxic sense-making, but we need to lay the foundation first. I hope this will bring some clarity and humility to one's understanding while being able to grasp the whole, or at least grasp the size and depth of a particular field instead of these narrow assumptions that cause prejudice and polarity. All the crises we are faced with can simply be understood as a crisis of perception. We aren't aware of the diversity in causes and effects of our actions due to reductionistic thinking, and therefore cannot act appropriately. How do we make sense in the face of reductionistic thinking, polarization, and information overload? We need something that's cognitively easier while being more capable. We need something that's nonlinear, which doesn't allow us to fall into several logical fallacies or modes of deception and confusion, resulting in linear sense-making. We need something that is highly integrated, something that can see the depth and breadth at a glance and focusing on the level of nuance desired. Something where any part of the hypothesis can be put into context and questioned. Something with more visual cues to increase our cognitive ease such that it's better suited to our cognitive landscape and comes more naturally. So with that in mind, what are some tools that we can bring with us on our path? What is something that can help bring us into right view? One critical tool in integrating these fragmented thoughts is mindfulness, but there's a lot out there on that, so I'm going to take a different view here. If we're interested in integrating fragmented thoughts, increasing attention span, or a non-goal-oriented approach of a spiritual path, the other side of a meditation practice is a contemplative practice. I'm going to introduce emergent mind mapping as the most effective and resonant contemplative practice I'm aware of. You can use this in various realms, from integrating your journal, finding clarity in your life and thoughts, understanding and storing insights from your field of study or a course you are taking, plan or collaborate on a project for a work project or a book, or a therapeutic emotional investigation with others. My practice is very much more in the academic realm, integrating my insight journal of epiphanies, concepts, mental models, philosophies, and other important things I've read. For all these activities, I'm proposing that there is a better way to write and organize information, a better way to contemplate and communicate. The linear structure we've been forced into, whether for the writer or the reader, puts limits on what can be understood and requires a lot more work. For the writer, it's difficult to assume the audience's perspective, ensure all the right information is presented at the right time, while not going onto too many different tangents to maintain focus. And for the reader, they have to sift through a lot more information than necessary to get the desired insights. I may return to this as a form of communication, but for today, ultimately, this shouldn't be viewed as trying to get to an end result. The end result, as I will explain, may be very useful, but what I really want to highlight here is the process of deep contemplation and its inherent insight generation if done appropriately. Since this can be applied in many different contexts, let's assume here that you have a topic of interest, something you are genuinely curious about and want to engage in effective understanding. There are many directions I could take this in, from what I mean by deep contemplation, from a cognitive science perspective, from a practical perspective, from a spiritual perspective, or what I mean by emergent mind mapping. I'd like to explain some practices and mental models in describing this process, and also describe a little bit about the interface and software of some digital mind mapping tools. And finally, how this is distinct from linear ways of thinking and contemplating, or from other ways of mind mapping. So I will do something a little different here, to first describe the practice and show you the mind mapping process, such that we can use it to visualize the theory of contemplation, the how and why it works. Throughout these videos, I will describe aspects that help you navigate as your mind map gets larger and more complex, and also new possibilities that emerge when you have a substantial sized mind map. So where to begin? What is emergent mind mapping? As some of you may have experienced when mind mapping from top down, especially on paper mind maps, you get to a certain level of depth and it just stops. You simply can't think of anything else to write, and the structure is rigid. And that's because you've labeled the topic with a word. By labeling it, you essentially tell your brain you understand what that thing means, and often fail to see how it exists in other contexts, or how interdependent it is, or some other caveats or nuances to it. This is the very essence of what we're trying to avoid here, that reductionistic labeling of an idea. Therefore, emergent mind mapping starts from the bottom. It starts with a complex and contextually rich insight into some aspect of study. I would recommend starting with many journal entries. If you don't have that, I would start with an insight journal. Or if it's for understanding a course or a book, you should have access to chunkable insights of information. Then throw everything you have in every domain at a single mind map. Don't give it really any structure to start, just make sure the nodes are small enough. Over time, you'll write journal entries that remind you of something else you had written. For now, just put it near or link directly to it. The beauty of a digital mind map is that you can easily move nodes around. Spend some time organizing the child nodes to not repeat themselves, and eventually patterns will form. Things will cluster together and form larger nodes. You will start to see the map grow organically. The nodes will split off sometimes, merge in others. Once you've scaled up, you'll see larger patterns will emerge, and sometimes the entire map will just get reorganized and everything will just click into place. You'll notice different flavors of questions, or categories that emerge. Sometimes a node might be the why, or the how, or a meta-commentary, or a reminder to your future self about it. Therefore, you'll want a coloring scheme to delineate between these. And you'll see that having this framework makes you remember to ask yourself these questions. Let these various mental models and frames or coloring schemes emerge organically. Don't start imposing these frames on any model before it naturally makes sense to. Once you have these coloring schemes, you can quickly visit the right node of interest without having to read all the text and understand what frame of mind it's coming from. So just at first glance, what do we notice that is different? Firstly, that ideas are spatially oriented and that they can move around easily. This gives us another dimension compared to writing, but more importantly, it uses the brain's natural location-based memory. It's a deeply rooted aspect of memory to recall where things are located. But furthermore, not just remembering where they are, but only having access to those memories when you're in that place. You may have experienced this when having a thought and going into another room to do the task and entirely forgetting what you had to do. Then you re-enter the first room and you remember it. Our environment will help us remember thoughts that you otherwise wouldn't have access to. And likewise, since written language, and especially with the rise of the internet, we are becoming more adapted to remembering where the knowledge can be found instead of remembering the details themselves. I will return to this later, but this phenomenon is so powerful that when I have a new entry, I can almost immediately zoom into the place where it fits very well, and I will often surprise myself with other nearby nodes that are precisely related. This is step one into integrating your journal. As in most people's journals, they can't retrieve ideas, let alone integrate ideas, as it's too difficult to find the right entry, quickly reference things, or even find a particular sentence in a single entry. The second feature we'll notice here is that thoughts can be quickly read and understood because we know what context it's in by what it's nested inside of, or some coloring scheme you've established. Quickly seeing the context grounds your thoughts and provides cognitive ease. Something like a book, which is linear, can give us a good sense of context as you must read it in order, but it takes a considerable amount more effort to understand the context at a glance. Contextual thinking is vital to proper sense-making, as we may become more focused on the content and forget about the context, and taking things out of context often creates this polarization and misunderstanding mentioned earlier. The last thing to notice here is how much we can hold in our attention. Of course, when things are faster to retrieve or easier to visualize, we use less cognitive bandwidth. When we are contemplating in our minds, we can maybe hold on to, 6 individual thoughts? Even on paper, it's difficult to encapsulate a thought and shuffle things around. But in a digital mind map, we can simply close off child nodes, hold on to more ideas and more interrelations between things, thereby increasing our relational thinking and how various concepts overlap and interconnect. Since you have all your insights and notes in one map, you'll start to see distant connections which otherwise you would have never thought of or remembered. Of course, there's still reason to have separate mind maps for certain things, but the core of deep contemplation of vast topics should all be in one. Contextual thinking and relational thinking are at the core of systems thinking, which we can see with the following systems theory authors. Daniel Christian Wall, in his book Designing Regenerative Culture, invites us to live in the question, to ask good questions instead of seeking good answers. Just as systems theory is transdisciplinary, so is this practice, as I've showed various ways in which it can be used. So I can't generalize explicit questions for you to ask yourself, but simply by engaging in the mind map in this way, it will invoke you to see different interrelations between things. I recommend you experiment yourself and see what kind of questions arise and determine what structure best fits what you were contemplating. Tyson Yunkaporta, in his book Sand Talk, describes a deep convergence of Australian indigenous wisdom and systems theory. Their tribe has this practice of relational thinking, whereby allocating a concept some visual representation, such as their fingers, and practice contemplating the relationship between each possible arrangement. Simply noticing how the contents of consciousness apply in some other context, or in relation to some other concept, or from someone else's perspective, we generate insight and move towards perspectival thinking, which I will describe in the next video. This kind of self-guided relational thinking will generate insightful questions as we ponder the various ways in which things are interconnected and interdependent. This is an information technology, just like many others, from language to DNA. The reason why DNA can generate such complexity at vast different scales, from single cells to whales, is because the information technology is structured to be scale invariant. This is what allows fractals to form. It's due to a structure that can stay consistent across scales. If we want a new psychotechnology that can be adaptive to many situations and scales, we need it to be scale invariant. For this practice, at its atomic level, it's essentially just combining ideas. And in some sense, all ideas are combinations of other ideas. There's really no new idea you can have. So let's investigate what can happen when you combine ideas. You likely won't be explicitly conscious of the following distinctions I'll be talking about, but they will be implicit skills you will develop as you work through your mind map. When holding two ideas in mind, they can be a similar concept, and therefore you can abstract a hypothesis that better describes both of them. I'll call this abstraction. Maybe you'll keep both of them as an example, or one claim can support or validate another, and you may notice if this causal basis is a subjective or objective claim. Or they can be in similar concept but in different context, a different environment, application, or perspective, which can lead to recontextualization. If this recontextualization arrives at a similar conclusion, we can find convergence from multiple perspectives, thereby strengthening the network. Or they can contradict each other entirely, which I'll call rebuttal. Or they may seemingly contradict each other, but just in certain framings, leading you to finding nuance in the idea. I'm sure there are many others, but the structure of the mind map in this process can make these explicit yet intuitive. If we are using emergent mind mapping to study a particular discipline, we can know if we truly understand the basis and the interconnections of a concept instead of simply understanding it at its surface level. Being able to break down ideas into their component processes and rebuild them is therefore really important to the practice of contemplation. We exercise the ability to both deconstruct old ideas and combine new ideas, as we see some truth in each idea but contemplate the validity of their claims. If we are seeking rigor and effective understanding, you will naturally become aware of different kinds of questions, different kinds of justifications, and engaging in a practice of epistemology. You'll notice the shape of the mind map could either be very broad or very deep in a particular topic, and therefore you can see what areas you have knowledge in and which you have little, and seeing what is relevant at the high level, and you can guide your study towards what integral pieces you may be missing. I'm introducing this model as it's effectively a tool for integrating your journal and better sense-making, so let's see how it compares. Typically with linear journaling, as you have disparate ideas stored in various places, you don't see the patterns throughout your journal, as you can't return to items easily. Therefore, it's possible you have been writing the same thing in your journal from time to time and not seeing the connections throughout, either forgetting some intention or insight, or simply not seeing the larger patterns in your lives and thoughts. You may get glimpses of a theme or concept you remember, but since it's not available, you'll very likely misunderstand or misrepresent these vague concepts and come to faulty conclusions, as it's easy to equivocate or inject poor conclusions with sleight-of-hand argumentations by using the same non-precise label for two different things in different contexts, thereby leaping from one domain to another without knowing it. This at best causes confusion and bad sense-making, and at worst confuses our entire metaphysics and way of being simply with false analogies and word tricks. If we're trying to resolve things in our heads or on paper, we will often get swept up by the stream of consciousness, as without the ability to separate text into nodes or use symbols or colors, you can't easily return to a thread, you can't recognize different ways in which you're questioning or have metacognition on a topic. At this point, you still have a small or medium-sized mind map. Things may be shifting around until you have a good high-level structure that you can interconnect and have relevant colors or symbols for your particular way of thinking about this topic. There's a balance here to what you think is relevant to add and how conscious you are in adding things. The more you recognize how things interrelate, the more insight you will have. Once you have a substantial-sized mind map, you will thank yourself for having rigor and good discernment of what to include in your mind map and what not to keep notes concise and to have a conscious process when adding more information and contemplating. If you throw everything into it and never spend time integrating it or put unconscious half-thought-out items, then you'll start to trust the map less. There will be less interconnectedness, leading to less clarity and insight. Ultimately, when you have written it all yourself, you'll remember where they are, as opposed to copying and pasting it. So do yourself a favor, treat this like any other practice. Don't try to race towards the finish, as again, this is about the process of seeing the patterns of connections between things, not simply a better way to store your thoughts or create something from it. Most importantly, be curious about what you've written and enjoy the process. This may seem difficult to you, but I assure you it brings a lot of cognitive ease, and in my case, it repeatedly creates flow states. As I mentioned, flow states require a previous breadth of work such that you are slightly more challenged than your level of competence, which is the case here because it's topics you've already thought of, but it integrates them in a much larger context. Depending on your use case, emergent mind mapping can feel like being your own therapist or reading the most meaningful novel you could have read. Contemplation is vital in becoming an integrated being, overcoming our shadows and understanding our path. It should be humble and curious. It should seek towards truth and avoid circular logic and other logical traps we can fall into. Without a contemplation practice, it's very easy to over-attribute how much you understand a topic. It typically requires you explaining it to others until you really understand it, which is a theme we'll get into in the next video. We will also investigate various mental models and ways of thinking to overcome some of these traps, and how they can be applied. Throughout the series, I hope to make it clear of how the structure of emergent mind mapping lends itself to many aspects of effective understanding and systems thinking. By focusing on relational thinking, we can be grounded in a more rigorous description, while at the same time practice radical open-mindedness as you start to see how different perspectives converge.
Hey there, so some of you know this series is getting turned into a book or two, so if you want to keep up to date with the book launch or see some preliminary videos as I kind of release a few chapters here and there, consider subscribing, and please let me know if you have any questions or comments. Glad to hear them as I'm writing through this book.